So I mentioned earlier that we are in the sermon series entitled The Objective Meaning of the Crucifixion. And last week we looked at the cross. And this week we are going to look at the crown of thorns. And I was grateful that the crown of thorns was able to fit on the top of the cross here because it's sharp. Lori Hyman and Ken were generous enough to let me use their crown of thorns. It's sharp. So if you come up here, don't let your kids mess with it because it will actually hurt them probably. But the crown of thorns is a very interesting concept. And there's actually a claimed literal crown of thorns that Jesus wore. The first reference in history we find to the crown of thorns that Jesus wore was in 409, and it originally resided in Jerusalem. And it was there from 409 is when we first hear about it. But it was there until 1063 when it was moved to Constantinople. I'm not sure why it was moved, but it stayed there for about 175 years. And then Baldwin II of Constantinople gifted the crown of thorns to Louis IX of France to gain support as a gift of trying to build relationships of some level of political alliance. And when King Louis got this, he built the Saint Chapelle in France to house the crown of thorns. And it stayed there for a few hundred years until after the French Revolution, and then it entered the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And this is where current events come to mind, as many of you may remember the fire that happened at that cathedral in April of 2020. It's almost 2 years ago now. And you know, the crown of thorns is made of wood. It's vine branches type of things. After 2,000 years, it will be thoroughly dry. Right? I mean, so that's going to catch fire real fast, but fortunately it was saved from the fire, and so it continues to exist there in France. And so the crown of thorns is kind of an iconic concept of the crucifixion. Now, it's not mentioned in all four Gospels. Luke does not mention the crown of thorns. It is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and John, but not Luke. But even so, it's something we're familiar with. Even those who may be outside the church may not have a extensive knowledge, but have heard of the crown of thorns, and it's something that's in our society. But this concept of thorns is other places. There actually is a starfish that's called the crown of thorns starfish. And it's a fascinating thing, and you see it there on the screen. And it's the different colors of the starfish represent the different diets that it may have. This starfish is actually kind of a nuisance. It eats coral polyps, and so the starfish can destroy coral real fast, and there are different efforts they have to try to control the population to make sure that no more coral actually is destroyed. But it's a large starfish, and it's about the second largest starfish. It's almost a meter long or wide, so it's like 3 feet. That's a big starfish. I think of starfishes as being 5-6 inches, but it's almost 3 feet across. And it's got over 20 arms. It can regenerate like most starfishes. And the thing, it's called the crown of thorn starfish because it's got spikes that come up off it. I mean, it makes sense that's why it would be the crown of thorn starfish. And these are venomous spikes. And the starfish is slow. It doesn't move very quickly, and so it needs these spikes to protect itself. In fact, it has very few predators, which is why it's a real nuisance on the reefs, because nothing will eat it, but yet it can go and eat the reef and destroy that. But one of the main predators that it has is Triton's trumpet. It's a sea snail. And as I was looking into this, it can take about 4 hours for the sea snail to catch and kill the crown of thorns starfish. That's a long time. You talk about a suspenseful moment for 4 hours watching these two slow animals chase each other. I probably shouldn't laugh when we're talking about life and death like that, but the reality is not much eats it. So it's a thorn in the side of the reef. But the crown of thorns is something that's iconic with the crucifixion of Jesus. It's an important piece of what Jesus is doing for us through his death. And we come to Mark chapter 15, starting in verse 16. where we find that the soldiers took Jesus to the governor's courtyard called the Praetorium and called out the entire regiment. They dressed Jesus in a purple robe, and they wove thorn branches together into a crown and put it on his head. Then they saluted him and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him on the head with a reed stick, spit on him, and bowed down in mock worship. When they were finally tired of mocking him, they took the purple robe off, dressed him in his own clothes again, and then they led him away to be crucified. Now, before we get into the thorn part, I want to unpack the concept of a crown. And crowns aren't something we see very often in our society, particularly because we do not have a monarchy. We don't have a king or a queen. All of our officials are elected. But crowns show power. They show wealth. Crowns are expensive. They're made of precious items, of gold or something like that. And they're adorned with precious stones like diamonds and emeralds and rubies. And so when we see somebody who has a crown, we recognize they have a great deal of disposable income. They don't have to worry about paying the rent. They don't have to worry about putting food on the table. They have a lot of money. And so it's a wealth symbol. And power is something that throughout history, people have longed to obtain. We can think of in Mark chapter 10, where James and John, two of the disciples of Jesus, they come to Jesus and they say, "Hey, when you come in your glory, let one of us sit on your right and the other on your left." They recognize that Jesus is the king, and they wanted to be in places of honor next to him. That is a temptation that is not new. It's a temptation that's always been, and it probably always will be. The temptation for power, the temptation for honor, the temptation for status. But as I said, most crowns are made of beautiful and precious items because they're ornate. Not only is it to show that you have wealth, but you want others to see that you're beautiful, that there's something special about you. Now, in our society today, if you knew somebody that walked around with a crown on their head, you would think they were a little ostentatious. It doesn't really fit our society. Now, there are times we may make an exception, or at least maybe we pretend. Think of little kids, and probably more commonly, like little girls will wear tiaras or something like that. They're plastic and they're not worth much. But we see that we want to adorn ourselves in things that are beautiful. We want to be noticed for good things. And so the crown highlights that, whether it's big, whether it's small. But it also highlights royalty. You see the monarchies in this world today, they wear crowns when they are doing official royal business. And the bigger the crown usually means the higher the rank. And this would make sense that the king would have a bigger crown than the prince, and the queen a bigger crown than the princess. But at the same point, it's not just rank, it's status. And the fact of the king is above the prince, and so the king has a bigger crown. The king has more resources, has more things on their shoulders, more responsibility. But we come to Jesus, and we recognize that he was crowned with the crown of thorns, and we see that the King of Kings was crowned with suffering. Jesus, and I touched that, and it's sharp, so I'm not joking when I say don't touch that. So the King of Kings was crowned with suffering. Even though we as humans, we want ourselves to be glorified, we want to be built up, Jesus came to rescue us so that we could glorify God. Because what Jesus does is he comes and he restores us so that we can be the image bearers that God created us to be. When God created humanity, he created us in his image. And so through Jesus, that image is being restored. Jesus makes it so we can have the genuine existence that God created us to have. And that's one of the lies of sin. The sin says, ooh, this is better. This would give you a more fulfilling life. This would make life better. This would give you what you really want. But Jesus says, I know why you were created. I know the purpose God has for you. And so Jesus says, I'm coming to restore that purpose. And we see in Jesus that God's love is displayed. And so, as I said, Jesus was not just crowned with a crown. He had thorns in that, as we are well aware. And thorns have a purpose in our world. Whether it's a good purpose or not, we can debate. But thorns have a purpose. And as I illustrated earlier by accidentally touching the thorns, they hurt. They're not fun to touch. Now, you can gently touch them and get away with it in the same way you can touch a knife and not cut yourself. But if you're not paying attention, you can easily hurt yourself on thorns. Your skin can bleed and cause pain with that. But also, if a thorn pokes you, it can break off inside your skin, which causes infection and significant pain. And it's just really not a fun situation. But the purpose of thorns is to protect itself. Most plants that have thorns, as we can recognize, have thorns to protect the plant from animals that would want to eat the plant. Probably the example that sticks out most profoundly to me is that of roses. I love roses, and roses have thorns on them. So if you want to handle a rose, you've got to be careful. You've got to take caution. Now, I know science can do a lot of manufacturing and edit some genetics and get thorns out of there in certain situations. But thorns are there to protect the plant from animals that would want to eat it. But another thing thorns do is thorns assert dominance. If a plant is growing that has a lot of thorns, another plant that tries to grow next to that plant has to contest with thorns. So the thorns of the original plant can pierce the stalks of the other plant, which can cause disease. It can make that part of the plant die. It can make it just difficult for the other plant, which is part of what the world does to us. The world tries to assert its dominance and say, you want to grow, but we're not going to let you. So thorns are there to remind us that there are powers in this world that seek to hold us down, that seek to make life more difficult, that they don't want to relinquish the control they have, which in part is why the world doesn't like Jesus. Because Jesus came to say, I'm establishing a new power. I'm going to be doing something different. Not as though Jesus was establishing a new human form of government, but he was establishing God's rule and God's reign when he's coming and he's ushering in the kingdom of heaven. So the world doesn't like that. The world is threatened by Jesus, and so the world puts its thorns out to try to protect itself and knock down the competition. But the thorns are also a sign of sin, a sign of the curse. If you remember Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve have just sinned, and God is issuing the punishments and the consequences of the sin. And he goes to Adam, he says, you're going to have to work the ground, but it's going to be hard. He goes and God says in Genesis chapter 3, verse 18, he's talking about the ground, it will grow thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat of its grain. Because of sin, it's hard to grow crops. And all the farmers said amen, right? The reality is, it's difficult. The thorns make life difficult for us, and it shows us that we are living in a world that is under the curse of sin. And so we come to Jesus and we see that he was crowned with the crown of thorns. So the crown of thorns was made possible because sin actually entered the world. If there was no sin, the crown of thorns would not be possible to be made. But Jesus came to heal. He came to restore. And I think it's important we recognize that Jesus didn't come just to cover, he came to restore. He didn't come to say it's okay that you sin. He came to cleanse us from that sin so that we could be made whole, so that we could be restored to God. So even though the crown of thorns is evidence that we live in a fallen and sinful world, Jesus came to restore it. But the crown of thorns placed on Jesus' head shows us that Jesus was mocked, but also shows us why he came. Now, I alluded earlier, and the crown of thorns that's claimed to be worn by Jesus is in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Whether we say that's actual or not, I mean, that's debatable. But the reality is, if it's always interesting to me to figure out what the object was. What type of thorns actually did Jesus wear? And so if we assume the crown of thorns in Notre Dame is the actual crown of thorns Jesus wore, we would find that the thorns came from the plant called the jujube tree. And this is not a tree that's around here, but it's a tree that's about 40 feet tall, going to be anywhere from 18 to 40 feet is kind of what they generally estimate. And some even refer to it as a bush because it's not all that tall, but even 18 feet is pretty tall in my opinion. But there are thorns on this plant, and the fruit that it produces is similar to a fig in size, but it tastes like an apple. When I read it tastes like an apple, it reminds me of whenever people eat meat, they say, well, it tastes like chicken, because everyone's had chicken. But so I've never had one, but that's just things I came across and I read. And so we find that these thorns are somewhere 1 inch, 2 inches. They can be long thorns. They're not just minor inconveniences. They can cause real damage. They protect the tree and its fruit from those that would try to destroy it. The crown of thorns is real. Whether it came from the jujube tree or something else, the crown of thorns is real. And the crown of thorns shows that Jesus came to do something. He came to start something new, start fresh. And maybe we can say that Jesus came to start a revolution. But his revolution was not to establish a new human government. It was to establish something different. And so we come to the cross, we come to the crucifixion, we come to the crown of thorns, and we say, what is God doing here? What was God trying to accomplish through Jesus' suffering? And on many levels, we can say that God deals with evil through Jesus' suffering on the cross. Because any dealing with evil it goes through Jesus. When God deals with evil, it goes through Jesus, through his suffering, through his death. But sometimes that can bring us to conclusions that we don't necessarily want to make, or can cause us to make points we don't want to make. Because when we talk about evil and how Jesus died on the cross to defeat evil, we can get real easily to this point of, well, Jesus came, so we either go to heaven or we go to hell, which we would say is true, but he came for something deeper than that. So if it's just, well, we believe in Jesus, we go to heaven, we don't believe in Jesus, we go to hell, well, why did Jesus have to suffer? Because they can bring us to the question of, is God just a bloodthirsty tyrant? Is he just mad and has to take out his anger on something? Is that just what God is? And it makes us almost conclude that we can't trust God, that he's out of control. And some reject this concept as it goes too far for what the biblical narrative is actually saying. And so we go back to the Bible and say, what is it saying? What did Jesus do? What is Jesus' purpose on the cross? And I think it's important we recognize that Jesus came to rescue us. He didn't come so we could escape. And that's important. Jesus didn't come to cover us. He came to cleanse us. Now, when he cleanses us, he also covers us. But if we only stop at the covering, then we say, well, Jesus came. I can't fix sin, but I can pay for it, but it's still going to be there. Now, I'm not saying that sin is fixed right now. Jesus can do healing work in our life. But when we get to the end of Revelation, we'll find that Jesus comes and restores all things. But Jesus came to rescue. He didn't come just limited. His purpose was not limited to so we could escape. But then we still have the question of is God vengeful? Is God sitting up on his throne in heaven, fuming because he hates sinners and wants to punish them? Almost as though is God the little kid with the magnifying glass trying to burn the ants. Is that what God is trying to do? I'm going to get them this time. Is that how God is functioning? Is that why Jesus suffered on the cross with the crown of thorns? Is that what was happening? Because if we believe that, if that's where we conclude, then we can also conclude that God tries to solve the world's problems with violence. And we know violence doesn't solve problems. You know, wars don't say who was right. It just says who won. And that's really important for us to recognize. See, God's not solving the world's problem through violence in the same way that we solve the world's problems through violence. See, the crucifixion shows that Jesus won victory over the world. And the paradox that happens from Jesus is that through death comes life. Jesus died not so that we would die. He died so that we could live. His death brings life. So what's going on? How do we conclude of what's going on with the crucifixion, and how do the crown of thorns fit into that? And maybe we conclude that, well, the crucifixion really illustrates the love of God, which I would agree that it does. I would agree that God's love is displayed completely in Jesus. See, when Jesus died, when he suffered, he did so because he loved you. You didn't love him, but he loved you, and so he died for you specifically. And it's his love being poured out to you. And through Jesus' love, through his sacrifice, through his Spirit, we can be transformed. And through Jesus, we can have an understanding of what is the calling that we now have. Jesus shows us how to live. But we still have the question of, why did Jesus have to die? If Jesus died just so we escape condemnation, then we're missing part of what's happening here. He did that. Jesus died so that we could be free from condemnation. But it's more than just being free. It's more than just escaping. It's more than just providing a covering. Jesus died so that we could be restored. He died so that we could be reconciled. He suffered so that we could be the image bearers that God calls us to be. He didn't die so we could escape this world and go to heaven. He died to restore. Through Jesus, we see that we can now fulfill God's plan for humanity. God has a purpose for you, and it's not just to be a good person and wait for Jesus to come back. It's deeper than that. There's a purpose right now, which means what we do matters. Because of what Jesus did for us, what we do right now matters. Because it's not just a covering. It's not just an escape. It's a restoration plan that Jesus has for us so that we can bear the image of God again. That we can reflect God in our lives. The King of Kings was crowned with suffering so that we might be restored to God. But there's some irony here. In Jesus and the crown of thorns that he wore. We refer to Jesus as the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He is the top of the top. He's the best of the best. Jesus, there's nobody greater than Jesus, but yet he was crowned with suffering. That's what Jesus bore. But if we recognize that thorns from Genesis chapter 3, verse 18, are a result of sin, that they are a sign of the curse of sin, we see that Jesus literally bore the curse of sin while he was being crucified. It's not as though he had to die a horrific death to experience as much pain as possible to fulfill some obligation. The crown of thorns shows that Jesus is bearing the curse that the world has because of sin. That's what Jesus was doing on the cross. And we come to Isaiah chapter 53, and we see that it's referring to the suffering servant, which we conclude is Jesus. That Jesus suffered. He died. He died this horrific death, but his suffering was bearing the curse of sin that the world has been bearing since sin entered the world. But then we get to Revelation 19 and we see that Jesus is the conquering Messiah who is coming in to restore his people. He is defeating evil, and all this is made possible because of Jesus bearing the curse of sin. But this crown of thorns mocked Jesus. I have trouble reading that last line of the scripture reference I read. When the soldiers were finally tired of mocking Jesus, they took the robe off, they put his own clothes back on him, and they let him be crucified. When they were finally tired of it. I think there are a lot of people that are living in this life that continue to mock Jesus. And what I mean by that is there are some people that come to church every Sunday. There's some people that they may give something in the offering. There's some people that may volunteer a little bit. They may have a Bible in their home. They may have the Bible app on their phone. They may try to connect with Jesus, but man, they're not following Jesus. We want to be close to Jesus, but yet we're not following him. We want to do the things that Jesus, we want the benefits that Jesus provides. We want to escape and get to heaven, but we don't want to be changed right now. We don't want Jesus to disrupt our life right now, and so we're mocking him with that. See, the soldiers mocked Jesus in a very public way, a very obvious way, but we mock Jesus differently. We mock Jesus by ignoring him, by rejecting him, by not doing what he commands. See, the crown of thorns doesn't really have any value. There's nothing about it that somebody wants. It's really an inconvenience. It's a nuisance at best. But Jesus bore it as a sign of the curse. See, the sign above his cross when he was crucified read, "The King of the Jews." That was the charge against him. And the crown recognized that Jesus was the king. But he humbled himself to his accusers. As I think about Jesus and the suffering he endured, when he was arrested by the religious leaders or tried before the religious leaders, he could have defended himself, but he didn't. When he stood before Pilate, he could have defended himself, but he did not. When the soldiers were mocking and beating and crucifying him, he could have defended himself, but he did not. He suffered intentionally and willingly. He accepted being beaten, being mocked, being spit on, being tortured in all this way. He endured it all because of his love for us. One of the things I like to remember, particularly with the crown of thorns, so much of what Jesus endured was painful at best. The crown of thorns, if you're careful, you can grab it, you can touch it without really hurting yourself. But I doubt when the soldiers put the crown of thorns on Jesus, they just put it on real nicely. They probably shoved it on there. They may have twisted it a few times. They may have come back 10 minutes later and twisted it some more just for the fun of it. Remember, they were mocking Jesus, and when they got tired of him, that's when they crucified him. They did all these things, and it caused pain. It caused suffering. Thorns probably broke off in his flesh. It caused significant bleeding. It caused discomfort no matter how Jesus turned. In fact, when he grimaced in pain, it probably caused more pain from the crown of thorns because it moved his skin. The crown of thorns is not this safe thing. It's not this, just something with a cherry on top for what Jesus endured. It was painful. It was difficult. But it was the sign of the curse of sin. And Jesus bore it for us. In Romans chapter 8, verse 22, Apostle Paul writes, "For we know that all creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." Creation is groaning because of sin. The world is hurting because of sin. But we come to Revelation 22, verse 3, and it says, "No longer will there be a curse upon anything, for the throne of God and of the Lamb will be there, and his servants will worship him." Jesus is coming so that the curse can be lifted. But here's the great thing about Jesus. We don't have to wait around twiddling our thumbs to live in this reality that Jesus has called. We can begin to live in this curse-free world now. But there are too many of us that are living under the curse of greed, of guilt, of shame, of abuse, of addiction, of indifference, of apathy. We're living under the curse of those things, but Jesus says, you don't have to live that way anymore. You can come be free now. Jesus can take the curse from you. He says, I want to bear it for you. But too many times, we're doing it ourselves. And the examples I gave are examples that you can hide. You can be greedy and not let anybody know about it. You can be addicted to things and other people might not be aware. But Jesus knows. He knows the sin that is reigning in your bodies. He knows how you are choosing to live under the curse. And he says, you don't have to live that way anymore because I have already bore the curse for you. The question is Jesus the king of your hearts or not?